Her small, freezing hand gripped Tiana's apron so hard the fabric nearly tore. Rainwater soaked the girl's red sweater, mixing with the tears streaming down her face as she looked toward the dark parking lot. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice a fragile shiver. "Please, don't let him take me." The diner went dead silent. The grill stopped hissing. Every customer froze. But the man stalking this child had no idea who he was really messing with. Because this wasn't just a lost girl. She was the only daughter of the most ruthless Korean mafia boss in the Pacific Northwest. Stay with me until the very end, because the moment the black Mercedes fleet pulls into this gravel lot, the hunter becomes the prey in a way you will never forget. Before we dive into this incredible story of courage, make sure to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment below with your favorite underdog hero story. Now, let's set the scene. It's 3:15 a.m. in a rain-drenched corner of Seattle. The Midnight Spoon Diner is a neon island in a sea of darkness, smelling of old coffee and wet pavement. For Tiana Walker, this was just another graveyard shift, another night of being invisible to the world as she saved every cent to change her life. Tiana knew the rules of the night. Keep your head down, serve the coffee, and never get involved in other people's business. But Tiana had a fire in her that the cold Seattle rain couldn't put out. Across town, in a glass fortress overlooking the Puget Sound, Lee Joon-Seok sat behind a desk of polished obsidian, slicked-back hair, tailored suit, and tattoos that told the story of a decade of war. He was a man of absolute control. He moved millions with a phone call and silenced enemies with a look. He lived by one rule: sentiment is a death sentence. He hadn't felt a drop of emotion in years. But tonight, for the first time in his life, the great lion of the North was afraid, because for the last 60 minutes, his world, his 6-year-old daughter, Nari, had vanished into the storm. The hum of the overhead fluorescent lights was the only soundtrack to Tiana's life at 3 in the morning. It was a flickering, rhythmic buzz that seemed to vibrate in sync with the ache in her lower back. To the rest of Seattle, the Midnight Spoon was a ghost ship sailing through a sea of rain. But to Tiana, it was a battlefield where the stakes were measured in nickel and dime tips. She wiped the counter with a rag that had seen better days, her movements mechanical and weary. Tiana was 26, but on nights like this, the reflection in the polished chrome of the milkshake machine looked decades older. Her hair was pulled back tight, a practical choice for a woman who didn't have the luxury of vanity. She was a woman who lived in the margins, invisible to the businessmen who never looked up from their phones, and a phantom to the city that swept her under the rug the moment the sun went down. "Coffee, Tiana, black, like my soul," grunted old Pete, a regular who had occupied the same corner stool since the Carter administration. Tiana didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. She just poured. In this world, you survived by being a shadow. If you stayed quiet enough, you didn't get harassed. If you moved fast enough, you didn't get fired. She was saving every scrap of her paycheck for a nursing degree, a ticket out of the grease and the graveyard shifts. She had exactly $4,212 in a shoebox under her bed. It was the price of her freedom, and she defended it with a fierce, quiet desperation. The door chimes cut through the heavy silence, a lonely, tinny sound. Tiana didn't look up immediately. She knew the rhythm of the night. It was either a weary trucker or a drunk looking for eggs to soak up the regret. But the wind that swept in wasn't just cold, it was frantic. She felt it before she saw it, a shift in the air, a jagged edge of pure terror that didn't belong in a sleepy diner. Her eyes finally drifted toward the entrance, expecting a customer, but finding only the dark swirling mist of the Seattle storm. Then a small wet hand slapped against the glass of the door. Tiana's heart skipped. This wasn't a trucker. This wasn't a drunk. This was a child, no older than 6, drenched to the bone in a bright red sweater that looked like a bloodstain against the gray night. The girl's eyes were wide, darting toward the darkness of the parking lot, as if a monster was crouching just beyond the reach of the neon sign. In that moment, Tiana's invisible status vanished. The girl didn't see a waitress, she saw a lighthouse, and as those tiny shaking hands reached for Tiana's apron, the grueling weight of the graveyard shift was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Tiana Walker was no longer just a woman serving coffee. She was the only thing standing between a little girl and the abyss. The air on the 64th floor of the Obsidian Tower was thin, filtered, and smelled of expensive scotch and suppressed terror. Lee Joon-Seok sat at the head of a mahogany table that could have doubled as a runway, his silhouette framed by the panoramic glass that looked out over a rain-shattered Seattle. Down there, the city was a chaotic mess of lights and desperate people, but up here, Joon-Seok was a god. He didn't need to raise his voice. His power was in the stillness, the way his thumb traced the rim of a crystal glass, the way his dark, slicked-back hair didn't have a single strand out of place despite the storm raging outside. Across from him, 3 men in Italian suits were sweating, their eyes darting toward the 2 silent monoliths in dark suits standing behind Joon-Seok's chair. "The numbers are off," Joon-Seok said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. "And I don't like things that are off." One of the lieutenants opened his mouth to offer an excuse, but the sound of the heavy double doors swinging open cut him short. It was a sound that shouldn't have happened. No one interrupted the Tuesday briefing, not for fire, not for war. Park, Joon-Seok's most trusted advisor, stumbled into the room. His face, usually a mask of professional indifference, was the color of ash. He didn't wait for permission to speak. He didn't even look at the other men at the table. He walked straight to Joon-Seok and leaned down, whispering 4 words that stopped the rotation of the earth. "Na-ri is gone, sir." The glass in Joon-Seok's hand didn't shatter, he simply set it down with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. The mask of the calculating businessman evaporated, replaced by something ancient and predatory. The tattoos peeking out from beneath his crisped white cuffs seemed to writhe as his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. "Explain," Joon-Seok commanded. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "The transport was ambushed near the industrial district," Park stammered, his voice cracking. "2 of our men are dead. They found the car empty. The rear door was forced open from the inside. She ran, sir, into the storm." Joon-Seok stood up slowly. He didn't look at the lieutenants who were now shrinking into their chairs. He looked out at the rain, at the millions of flickering lights, realizing that somewhere in that cold, dark labyrinth, his 6-year-old daughter was alone, hunted, and terrified. She was the only piece of light left in a soul he had sold to the devil years ago. "Seal the city," Joon-Seok whispered, a terrifying calm settling over him, the kind of calm that precedes a hurricane. He turned away from the window, his eyes burning with a lethal paternal fire. The Lion of the North was no longer conducting a meeting, he was going to hunt. Tiana didn't waste a second. The moment the little girl's freezing fingers locked around her wrist, the waitress's survival instincts, honed by years of navigating the city's harshest corners, kicked into overdrive. She scooped Na-ri up, the child weighing no more than a bundle of wet laundry, and bolted toward the back of the diner. Old Pete started to ask a question, his mouth hanging open, but Tiana silenced him with a look that was sharper than any blade. "Lock the front door, Pete, now!" she hissed over her shoulder. She ducked into the pantry, a cramped space smelling of industrial flour and canned peaches. She set the girl down on a crate of potatoes and pressed a finger to her lips. The girl's teeth were chattering so loudly they sounded like pebbles in a tin can. Tiana pulled off her own uniform vest and wrapped it around the child's shaking shoulders. "Stay small, baby. Don't make a sound. I'm right here." Outside, the heavy thud of a car door closing echoed through the thin walls of the diner. Then came the sound of boots on wet gravel, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Crunch, crunch, crunch. It was the sound of a predator who knew her prey had nowhere left to run. Through the small, grease-stained window of the pantry door, Tiana saw a shadow pass by the kitchen. It was a man in a dark, heavy coat, his face obscured by the tilt of a brimmed hat and the relentless sheets of rain. He didn't try to force the door yet. Instead, he began to circle. He was testing the perimeter, looking for a weakness, his silhouette dragging across the frosted glass of the diner's main windows like a ghost. Inside the pantry, the silence was so thick it felt physical. Tiana reached behind her, her hand finding the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet hanging from a rack. It wasn't a gun, but it was solid, and she gripped it until her knuckles turned white. Nari let out a tiny choked sob, her eyes wide with a terror that no 6-year-old should ever know. Tiana pulled the girl closer, shielding the child's body with her own. She could hear the man's footsteps stop just outside the pantry's exterior wall. A soft metallic scratching sound followed, the tip of a knife or a tool tracing the wood, looking for a way in. Tiana closed her eyes, praying for the first time in years. She was just a waitress with a shoebox of savings and a shift to finish. She had no idea who this girl was or why the darkness wanted her so badly. All she knew was that as long as she was breathing, no one was crossing this threshold. The silence stretched, loaded and lethal, as the man in the rain stopped scratching and began to lean his weight against the back service door. In the suffocating dark of the pantry, the only light came from a sliver of neon blue bleeding through the doorframe. Tiana held her breath, listening to the heavy rain battering the roof and the predatory silence of the man outside. Every time the wind shrieked, Nari flinched, her tiny body vibrating against Tiana's chest. Tiana leaned down, her lips brushing the girl's ear. "You're safe," she mouthed, though the lie tasted like copper in her mouth. "Who is he, baby? Why is he following you?" For a long minute there was nothing but the sound of the girl's ragged breathing. Then the child leaned in, her voice a ghost of a whisper that chilled Tiana to the bone. "He's a bad man," Nari said, her English perfect but trembling. "He wants to hurt my appa. He said if he takes me, my appa will have to give him the city." Tiana's grip on the cast-iron skillet tightened. The city. People didn't talk like that unless they lived in a world of skyscrapers and shadows far above the grease of the midnight spoon. "Who is your father, Nari?" The girl looked up, her dark eyes reflecting the flickering neon. "Lee Joon-Seok," she whispered. Tiana felt the blood drain from her face. She lived in the margins, but even in the margins, you knew that name. Lee Joon-Seok wasn't just a businessman. He was the urban legend parents used to keep their children quiet. He was the dragon of the North, the man who owned the docks, the warehouses, and the very ground Tiana walked on. She wasn't just hiding a lost child, she was holding the most precious cargo in the Pacific Northwest, and the most dangerous. "They killed the guards," Nari continued, her voice gaining a haunting flat quality that comes from sudden trauma. "The car crashed. I crawled out the window and ran because Appa told me to always run toward the light. I saw your sign." Tiana looked at the glowing open sign reflected on the floor, a beacon of cheap coffee and sanctuary. She realized then that the man circling the building wasn't a common predator. He was a professional, a scavenger trying to topple an empire by stealing its heart. The scratching at the door stopped. A heavy rhythmic thud took its place, the shoulder of a man who knew exactly how much force it would take to splinter the wood. Tiana pulled Na-Ri into the furthest corner, behind a stack of flour sacks. She realized her nursing school savings wouldn't help her now. Her invisible life was over. She was a waitress in a stained apron, protecting a princess from a monster, waiting for a dragon to arrive. While Tiana crouched in the suffocating silence of the pantry, the city of Seattle began to scream. From the industrial docks of Elliott Bay to the rain-slicked heights of Capitol Hill, a shadow fell over the streets that had nothing to do with the storm. Lee Joon-Seok had stepped out of his glass tower, and with a single sharp nod, he had unchained the hounds of his empire. Black USVs cut through the midnight traffic like sharks through water, ignoring sirens and red lights. In the back of the lead vehicle, Joon-Seok sat in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. He didn't look at his phone. He watched the rain-streaked window, his eyes scanning every alleyway and every flickering neon sign. His men were no longer just soldiers. They were a 100-headed beast tearing the city apart. Joon-Seok's voice crackled over the secure radio, cold and final. "I don't want excuses. I want my daughter. If she is in a basement, I want the house leveled. If she is in a car, I want the road closed. Every person who was on the street at 3 a.m. is a suspect until I say otherwise." He looked down at his hand, realizing he was still holding Na-Ri's hair ribbon, a small silk bow he had found tucked into the seat of his desk earlier that day. It was a fragile, pink contrast to the tattoos that marked his skin and the blood that stained his history. To the world, he was a monster to be feared, but to the girl in the red sweater, he was just Appa. As the sirens blurred into a single distant wail, Joon-Seok felt a sudden sharp intuition. He looked toward the outskirts of the industrial district, where the buildings grew shorter and the lights grew dimmer. Somewhere out there, the trail had gone cold. He didn't know that miles away, in a diner that smelled of grease and old dreams, a woman with nothing to her name was doing the one thing his millions couldn't. She was keeping his heart beating. "Head south," he ordered his driver, his voice a low growl. "Search the diners, search the 24-hour stops. She wouldn't stay in the dark. She would look for a light." The splintering of wood was a sudden violent crack that cut through the rhythm of the rain. The pantry door groaned under the heavy boot, and Tiana knew her time had run out. She pushed Na-Ri deeper behind the flour sacks, her small body trembling so violently the bags hissed. Tiana didn't reach for a phone or a panic button. She reached for the only thing she had, a massive industrial container of cleaning lye and the heavy cast-iron skillet she had gripped until her palms bled. A final, thunderous kick sent the service door flying off its hinges. The man stepped into the kitchen, a silhouette of jagged edges and cold intent. He didn't look like a common thief. He moved with the surgical precision of a hired killer. He held a suppressed pistol with a casual, terrifying familiarity. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the darkened kitchen before locking on the pantry. "Come out, little princess," he rasped, his voice scraping against the silence. "Don't make this harder for the lady." Tiana didn't wait. As the man stepped past the fryers, she kicked the pantry door open with everything she had. The sudden movement caught him off guard, and before he could level his weapon, Tiana flung the open container of lye directly at his face. He hissed, instinctively throwing his hands up to shield his eyes as the caustic white powder clouded the air. He fired a blind shot that shattered a stack of ceramic plates, the noise deafening in the small space. Tiana didn't retreat. She lunged forward, swinging the heavy skillet with a raw, desperate strength born of a lifetime of being pushed around. The iron connected with his temple with a sickening thud. He stumbled back, his head hitting the edge of the stainless steel prep table, but he was a professional. He didn't go down. He lunged for her throat, his fingers digging into Tiana's skin, pinning her against the industrial refrigerator. Tiana clawed at his face, her lungs burning, her vision blurring. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Nari watching, her small face frozen in horror. "Run, Nari!" Tiana choked out, but the air was leaving her. Suddenly, the night exploded. The parking lot was flooded with a blinding, clinical white light. The sound of screeching tires and slamming doors drowned out the storm. The man froze. His eyes darted toward the front windows just as a dozen black SUVs skidded into the gravel, their headlights piercing through the diner like the eyes of a vengeful god. The stalker's grip loosened. He saw the inevitable. He saw the fleet of black Mercedes-Benz vehicles and the men in dark suits spilling out like a shadow coming to life. Tiana shoved him away with one final gasping effort, collapsing to her knees as the front glass of the diner shattered inward. The dragon had arrived, and he wasn't alone. The air in the diner didn't just chill, it solidified. The heavy boots of the Mafia's elite hit the linoleum in a rhythmic, terrifying cadence, but they all stopped the moment Lee Joon-Seok stepped through the shattered remains of the front door. He didn't look like a man, he looked like a force of nature dressed in charcoal wool. His eyes swept the room, bypassing his men, bypassing the cowering stalker being pinned to the floor by 4 guards, until they landed on the back of the kitchen. Tiana was still on the floor, gasping for air, her throat blooming with purple bruises. She was hunched over, her body a physical shield in front of the pantry. In her hand, she still gripped the cast-iron skillet, her knuckles white, her gaze defiant, even as she shook. She didn't know the man in the tailored suit was the father. She only saw another threat. "Get back!" she rasped, her voice a broken thread. She didn't move. Even with 20 armed men in the room, she refused to let her guard down. Joon-Seok stopped. The Dragon of Seattle, a man who had never asked for anything in his life because he simply took it, found himself frozen by the sight of a woman in a coffee-stained apron who looked ready to fight him to the death. He saw the lie on the floor, the blood on the table, and the raw courage in Tiana's eyes. He realized in an instant that this nobody had done what his multi-million-dollar security detail could not. "Appa!" The cry was small and piercing. Nari scrambled out from behind the flour sacks, dashing past Tiana toward the man in the center of the room. Joon-Seok's composure, the legendary mask he had worn for decades, didn't just crack, it disintegrated. He dropped to his knees, heedless of the glass shards and the grime on the floor. He caught his daughter in an embrace so tight it seemed he was trying to pull her into his very soul. He buried his face in her wet red sweater, his shoulders heaving once, twice, in a silent, shuddering release of agony. The room held its breath. The most feared man in the city was kneeling in a greasy diner, weeping into a child's neck. After a long moment, Joon-Seok stood, his daughter still tucked firmly into the crook of his arm. He turned to Tiana. The lethal fire in his eyes had been replaced by something heavy and hallowed. He walked toward her, and for the first time in his life, Lee Joon-Seok bowed his head to someone who didn't carry a weapon or a title. "You protected her," he said, his voice thick with a genuine, raw humanity. He reached out, not with the hand of a boss, but with the hand of a father, offering it to Tiana to help her up. "The world saw you as a waitress, Miss Walker. Tonight, I saw a lioness. You have the eternal gratitude of the Lee family, and that is a debt that can never be fully repaid." The The chaos of the storm had settled into a cold, clinical efficiency. Outside, the Stalker was dragged into the back of a black SUV with a silence that was far more terrifying than any scream. He had become a ghost before he even left the parking lot. Inside the Midnight Spoon, the air was still thick with the scent of lye and spent adrenaline. Tiana stood by the counter, her hands finally beginning to shake as the reality of the night crashed down on her. She looked at her reflection in the coffee urn, the bruised neck, the torn apron, and felt the strange, hollow weight of a life that had been irrevocably altered. Joon-Seok didn't leave immediately. He stood by the door, watching his men secure the perimeter, while Nari refused to let go of his hand, her other small fist still clutching a corner of Tiana's discarded uniform vest. The Mafia boss turned back to Tiana, his presence filling the humble diner with a gravity that made the neon lights seem dim.
"This place," Joon-Seok said, his eyes scanning the cracked vinyl booths and the grease-stained menus. "You work here for $4 an hour plus the mercy of strangers. You hide your dreams in a shoebox because you think the world is too small to hold them." Tiana stiffened, her pride flickering. "It's honest work. I'm going to be a nurse." A ghost of a smile touched Joon-Seok's lips, not one of mockery, but of profound respect. "You were a nurse tonight. You tended to a soul that was breaking. But from this moment, you will never have to count pennies again." He signaled to Park, who stepped forward and placed a sleek black leather folder on the counter. "In there is the deed to a building on Fifth Avenue. It is currently a private clinic. It is yours. The staff, the equipment, the funding, it is all settled. You will finish your degree not in the middle of the night, but at the best university in the country, with every door opened for you." Tiana stared at the folder, her breath hitching. "I can't take this. I didn't do it for money." "I know," Joon-Seok replied, his voice dropping to a low, resonant frequency. "That is why it must be you. You are the only person in this city who protected my daughter because it was right, not because it was profitable. This isn't a payment, Tiana. It's an investment in a world that needs more people like you." He leaned in closer, the tattoos on his neck visible in the flickering light. "You have a home, a career, and a future, and you have me. If anyone ever makes you feel invisible again, you tell them my name. You saved the dragon's daughter. Now the dragon watches over you." With a final respectful nod, he guided Nari toward the door. The little girl looked back one last time, blowing a kiss toward the waitress who had become her shield. As the fleet of black cars pulled away, leaving the diner in a sudden ringing silence, Tiana reached out and touched the leather folder. The shoebox under her bed was no longer her only hope. The invisible woman was gone. In her place stood someone the city would never dare to overlook again. 6 months later, the rain still fell over Seattle, but it no longer felt like a shroud. Tiana stood behind the glass doors of the Walker Community Clinic, watching the droplets race down the pane. She wasn't wearing a stained apron or a name tag that people ignored. She wore a crisp white lab coat with her name embroidered in silk. The ache in her back from the graveyard shifts had been replaced by the steady, purposeful stride of a woman who owned the ground she walked on. She was no longer a ghost in her own city. When she walked down the street, the shopkeepers nodded with a newfound hushed respect. They didn't just see a nurse, they saw the woman who survived the night at the Midnight Spoon. But the true change was more subtle, felt in the shadows. A black sedan was always parked a discreet half-block away, not as a threat, but as a sentinel. The men in the neighborhood who once whistled or hovered too close now stepped aside, their eyes hitting the pavement the moment she approached. The bell above the clinic door chimed, and Tiana didn't flinch. She didn't reach for a skillet or hide in a pantry. She looked up and smiled as a small figure in a familiar red coat darted inside, followed by the towering, silent presence of Lee Joon-Seok. Nari didn't wait for permission. She sprinted across the lobby and hugged Tiana's waist, her laughter filling the sterile modern space with a warmth that no heater could provide.
Joon-Seok remained by the door, his hands clasped in front of him. He looked younger, the lethal tension in his jaw softened by the sight of his daughter's joy. He didn't come to collect a debt, he came to honor one. "She insisted on bringing you these," Joon-Seok said, gesturing to the bouquet of white lilies in Nari's hand, "and she wanted to show you her report card." Tiana took the flowers, their scent sweet and heavy. She looked at the man who had once been a myth of terror and saw the truth. They were bound by a night of blood and rain, a waitress and a warlord bridged by the innocence of a child. She had given him back his heart, and in return, he had given her a throne from which she could heal her community. As the sun began to peek through the Seattle clouds, casting a golden glow over the clinic, Tiana realized the invisible girl was gone forever. She was a guardian now, a woman of substance and steel. She had stepped into the storm to save a stranger, and in the process, she had saved herself. The dragon still watched the gate, but Tiana Walker was the one who held the keys.